I'm going to introduce myself, and I'm going to talk about the national landscape of what's going on with LGBT rights in the workplace, and also talk about what happened yesterday in the legislature here in Indiana and some of these legislative developments. And then David's going to talk about himself and give you more details about Indiana-specific rights in the workplace and other surrounding states. And then we'll have more of an organic discussion, open up for questions and dialogue. I have been out, not as a lesbian, which really confuses people. I've been out as bisexual for 23 years. I came out in college, and I've been out pretty much at every job I've had since. And ironically, the most discrimination I've ever faced has been from the LGBT community for not being 100% lesbian. I really haven't had any bad experiences in the workplace. And I've worked in a variety of types of jobs. I've worked at a legal aid office. I worked at a private law firm. I've worked at various nonprofit public interest organizations in DC. And I've taught now at 2 law schools. And everywhere I've lived, I have not had full legal protections, but I've always felt accepted by my colleagues and by my bosses. And in fact, in law school, I was advised to be careful about what's on my resume. You never know the prejudices of the person reading your resume. And I was advised, I got a lot of advice that I didn't take, and I'm glad I didn't take it, because that advice maybe works if you're going into a certain segment of corporate America, but even less so today. Because these days, diversity is really valued by most companies. Most companies want to view themselves as open to all people and as fair. So I honestly believe that for me, being out has been an advantage. A lot of companies want diversity. And it's part of what I do for a living. I mean, I teach constitutional law, and LGBT rights is part of that. So I'm well versed in what I do because of my background. It actually informs who I am and what I do professionally. So yes, there are going to be companies here in Indiana that may not be as accepting and may not be as tolerant. And as we're going to talk about, you don't have full protections yet in Indiana and other places in the states. But don't take that as a sign that universally you should be closeted and hide yourself, is the advice that I would give to you, because I think more and more exponentially this country is becoming more accepting, and companies really want to view themselves as being fair, I think. And I have never had a bad experience with employers. That said, I have had bad experience with students. Students do tend to be more vocal about their prejudices. But I'm a grown-up. I have thick skin. I can survive that. So that's my personal experience. And now I want to give you more of a landscape. What's going on with the laws in this country? Everybody probably knows that we got same-sex marriage rights in a recent Supreme Court case, but as the saying goes, you can now get married to your same-sex partner in the morning and get fired for being in a same-sex marriage in the afternoon. Because in the majority of states in this country still don't have full protections in the workplace, in housing, in public accommodations. Those are the 3 big categories of civil rights laws that protect people on the basis of race and gender and national origin and religion and all kinds of categories, but LGBT people are still left out. Sexual orientation and gendered identity are still left out. And I passed out a chart that shows just how many states still don't have employment protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And Indiana is one of those states. The purple is states that do have protection both from gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination. The blue are the states that just have sexual orientation discrimination protection. Indiana does not have sexual orientation or gender identity protection in our statewide civil rights statutes in either housing, public accommodations, or employment, which is what we're talking about today. And David's going to talk more specifically. There are some local ordinances in this state, but they don't have the kind of teeth that a real civil rights statute would have, where you can actually sue in court for real damages and really vindicate your rights. And not every, I think 60% of the counties in the state still don't even have the local ordinances. Now, just because we don't have full protections under our civil rights statutes in this state does not mean that you're without protection. If you're a person who is a transgender person or lesbian, gay, bisexual, and you get discriminated against in the workplace, you may have protections if you're working for a public employer in Indiana. You may even have protections if you're working for a private employer. You just don't have them through the state laws. But the federal laws are starting to protect against sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination more and more. Now, we have not yet passed ENDA. Who here has heard of ENDA? ENDA it's the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. ENDA is a federal statute that has been proposed that would basically add sexual orientation and gender identity to the other protected categories of discrimination. And it's been sitting there in Congress for decades, and it simply hasn't had the votes to pass. So we still don't have an official federal civil rights statute that includes sexual orientation and gender discrimination, but what we do have is this. We have this statute called Title VII. Title VII is a federal statute that prohibits gender discrimination. And in very recent years, federal courts and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Justice, not universally, but pretty consistently more and more, have said, you know what, if you discriminate against somebody because of their being LGBT, that's a form of gender discrimination. And it works kind of like this. Let's say that I go to work somewhere and I have a husband. And I take my husband to company events, and he's welcome to go wherever I go, and that's fine. But then let's say, same company, I have a wife, and all of a sudden my wife isn't allowed to go to events. There's comments made about it. Well, as a bisexual, my sexual orientation hasn't changed between those two scenarios. The only thing that's changed is the gender of my partner, right? So that kind of helps illustrate it's really a form of gender discrimination. So the courts, the EEOC, and the DOJ are starting to get that. They're starting to see that sexual orientation discrimination and definitely gender identity discrimination are forms of gender discrimination. And therefore, you can call the EEOC. If you get discriminated against, you can pick up the phone and you can call the EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And they investigate and they prosecute civil rights complaints. They can give you what's called a right to sue letter that gets you the ability to go to a private lawyer and file a lawsuit. You can call the EEOC, and they want you to know this. They are taking complaints from people who are discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation today. And this is very new. It's also not necessarily permanent, because this is what the administration is doing kind of informally, but it's not written into the federal statutes. The federal statutes don't say, and this includes sexual orientation. It's not that explicit. It's just being interpreted that way. So what can happen is if you get a president who is anti-LGBT, all of this could turn back around, in a year and a half. And the next administration could be hostile to LGBT rights and say, you know what, the EEOC is not going to take these complaints anymore. Okay, so that could happen. So until there's actually a federal statute that spells out sexual orientation and gender identity protections, you're not going to have those protections that are really secure and permanent. But that doesn't mean it's okay to discriminate either morally or under the law, because you do have protections. They're just not so direct and clear as others. What else? Now that you have marriage rights, there are also some tangential rights that come with that too. You should be getting the same kinds of benefits for your partners, for your spouses, regardless of whether your spouse is the same sex or a different sex. And that's just a really short version of what's going on nationally, but I'll take questions too during Q&A. Does anyone want to stop me with questions now? Any burning questions about the landscape of the laws? Okay.
Nancy,
yeah.
Are you going to talk about, or is David going to talk about Title IX also? Because recently there have been requests for exceptions to Title IX when it comes to colleges, and I thought maybe this forum might be a particular place that
We're really focusing on employment rights.
Okay, and if you are a an employee of a college,
Okay,
I think that has specific application. That's
Okay.
where I'm going with it.
okay, and no, I hadn't really put that into my prep, so I'm not really, do you want to elaborate on that some more?
Well, Title IX, it applies to colleges and universities. And it is how women's sports, for example, exist and came to prominence in American colleges and universities, because it requires that, everyone be treated equally, and that if you've got, 90% of your assets and your budget for men's sports, you're not treating people equally. Well, in the course of the development of Title IX, it has also come to the attention of particularly this administration that not providing opportunities for employment for LGBT students and faculty members within the university setting is also a violation of Title IX. That's kind of the accepted rule now.
Yeah.
And in response, a number of conservative religious institutions, a couple of them in Indiana, have applied to the administration for exemptions, saying, because of our particular situation, we shouldn't have to have this apply to us, and we shouldn't have to have, if we want to give benefits to married faculty members, that's okay. But, if they discriminate between types of married faculty members who get benefits as a term of employment, then they have to go back and say, okay, we need an exemption from Title IX in order to, run our benefits the way it is.
And that's a good bridge to where I was going to go next, which is there is this tension today across the country between civil rights for LGBT people and other contexts and religious freedom. And we're seeing that play out pretty dramatically in Indiana. We've actually gotten a lot of national attention in the state for the way that's played out here. And the most recent version of that played out yesterday in the state legislature. And I want to talk about that some. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what happened last year with the state RFRA. It's pretty complicated. But basically, there are those who believe they should be able to hold up religious freedom, not just as a sword, not just as a shield to protect themselves so that they can practice their religion, but as a sword to take away other people's rights. And that's when things get tricky, is when you have rights butting up against each other. And last year, well, I will talk about last year because that was got a lot of national attention. It was kind of the state legislative process at its worst. You may have heard the phrase, there's two things you never want to see up close in life, and that's watching sausage be made and watching laws get made. Basically the same kind of thing. It gets pretty awful. And so last year they had succeeded in passing this RFRA statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And as a law professor, I think it's really fascinating what that statute does, but you wouldn't. It all has to do with how courts look at what standard of review they apply when they look at religious freedom claims. But the charge against that bill was that it was being used to target, it was being used to justify discrimination against LGBT people. And at the time, the sponsors of RFRA said, no, this has nothing to do with LGBT people. That's not why we want this at all. Well, this year it was pretty clear that's what it was about, because it came in the context specifically of an LGBT rights bill. And they tried to reinsert that language that said if you have any religious objections to LGBT people, you can still discriminate against them. So it was called a gay rights bill that was defeated yesterday, but it really was not a gay rights bill, not like any I've ever seen, because it was filled with ways to keep discriminating against LGBT people. And T people were left out entirely. So it was a bill that would have added sexual orientation to the state civil rights statutes, but at the same time saying basically nobody has to comply with this if they say I'm religious. And adoption agencies can discriminate. So it would have actually incorporated an adoption ban. against same-sex couples adopting. De facto, that would have been the result of it, potentially. It would have taken the teeth out of the municipal ordinances that did exist. So it was the most anti-LGBT rights bill that's ever been proposed in this country. So, and it was a compromise. The sponsors thought, oh, okay, we'll throw in a little bit of gay rights stuff, and we'll throw in a little bit of religious freedom stuff, and everybody will be happy. But the result was everybody was unhappy. It's pretty much nobody who wanted that to pass on either side of the issue. And so it failed miserably yesterday and got yanked off the table. So the status quo is sexual orientation and gender discrimination still aren't included in the state civil rights statutes. And frankly, they won't be as long as this legislature is in place. It's just too hostile to LGBT rights, so that's just the way it's going to be. And I'm going to stop there and let David introduce himself and talk about more specifics with the laws.
Again, my name is David Amon. I'm a local practitioner and was recently an adjunct at the law school teaching juvenile law. And recognizing that first of all, it's a great turnout. I'm excited to see that there's not even enough seats for everyone in the audience. And I think you all probably are not members of the LGBT community. Hopefully, many of you are allies, but I think most of you are probably about to go out into the workforce, and you'll be interviewing, you'll be writing your resumes. And so I want to offer you all, and this should apply to all of you, I think, whether you're gay or straight, a few pieces of advice. The first would be, I think it's really, really important that you should all be true to yourself when you're applying for jobs. And I think you're going to find more success if you are true to yourself. Whatever, everyone has a unique background, they have unique personality characteristics, and to be yourself in an interview, you'll be much more successful. The second piece of advice, kind of more pertinent to the LGBT community, would be to know your rights, and then the third would be to know your employer. So I thought it would be helpful for me to tell you all a little bit about my personal experience. I've worked in Missouri, Illinois, and most recently in Indiana. So 3 big Midwestern states, and I can talk about the rights of people applying for jobs in those specific states. But wherever you end up applying for a job, you're going to want to know the rights in your community and your state. So starting with Missouri, I graduated from the University of Missouri School of Law in 2006, and I came out just a couple years before I graduated. And Missouri is a really conservative state, especially politically in the state legislature. So the year I graduated from law school was the year that the Missouri legislature chose to ban same-sex marriage in their constitution. And they were the first state in the country to do that. So you may have heard of other recent legislation that's pending, like they're kind of rivaling Indiana to be the super conservative state, where the legislature has proposed a bill recently where you couldn't say gay. It's the Don't Say Gay bill. It would prevent teachers from saying or talking about same-sex marriage or anything in schools. So anyway, that's the climate where I went to law school and graduated. And my first job, I was a public defender in St. Louis City at the trial office of the St. Louis City Public Defender's Office. And my career services department gave me a big piece of terrible advice, I think. And the climate in 1 decade has changed so much that I know you're not getting this advice today. It sounds like Nancy got the same advice, and that was that the legal profession is conservative, so you probably don't want to be out on your resume. And what I'm talking about, just in case it's unclear, being out on your resume means listing any affiliation with any gay organization or something like that. If it's important to you, my advice is be true to yourself and put it on your resume. So when I graduated from law school, I was a founding member of our first gay organization at the law school, which today they're called like outlaw groups commonly. We were called the Alliance for Tolerance and Diversity. I was really proud of that, and I followed my career services director's advice and didn't include it on my resume. So when I went to interview for the public defender's office, there was no indication of what my sexual orientation was. And in the interview process, I was, more focused on getting that job than I was on being true to myself. So I didn't come out. And then for a long, miserable year as I worked in St. Louis, I was in the closet, and I communicated with all of my employees, and to be honest, a public defender's office is one of the more liberal places, more open-minded employment environments that you can work in. And I was closeted. I went to all of these lunches with my colleagues, pretending to care about sports and other things that I had no interest in. And so, so gradually I sort of tiptoed out of the closet, and when I came out, I was the first out gay public defender in St. Louis. There were no gay out people in the prosecutor's office in St. Louis, no gay judges, and I came out to a few people, and it spread like lightning. And this was, in 2006, 2007. I vividly remember being in front of a judge with his clerks at the end of a docket, and we were just chit-chatting, and the clerk knew that I was dating a med student at Washington University in St. Louis. And I certainly had not communicated that to them, and that was a big red light to me that they obviously knew that I was gay. So it was a little bit rocky, and I think the reason it was so rocky, even back then when the world was a different place, was that I didn't have the self-confidence. I wasn't true to myself. I was kind of like almost being dishonest with who I was in my personal life, which prevented me from developing richer relationships with my colleagues. And the legal profession in particular is one where people work together, and you need to build relationships to be a successful attorney. So then in 2009, I moved to Chicago because my partner graduated from med school and matched in Chicago. And let me just touch real quick on knowing your rights piece. In Missouri, I would have been completely fine, legally speaking, if I had come out because Missouri has an executive order that would protect people on the basis of sexual orientation only in public employment. So when looking at the rights across states, I think it's useful to divide these rights into certain categories. So we have rights that pertain to people on the basis of sexual orientation and rights that pertain to people on the basis of gender identity. And it's unfortunate that those are separate, but many legislatures and many executive orders, like governors have issued executive orders that issue those protections only on the basis of sexual orientation, but not gender identity. So sometimes those are separate categories. And then also there are, generally speaking, separate categories for public sector employees and the private sector employees. So in Missouri, you only have rights on the basis of sexual orientation for public employees. Moving to Illinois, you have full employment non-discrimination rights. So it's a completely different landscape. The city of Chicago is wonderfully open-minded when it comes to employment. And I worked briefly at a plaintiff's firm doing toxic tort litigation related to asbestos. Was totally out, never had the slightest issue. And then there was a really interesting development in my career, and that is that being out actually helped advance my career in a positive way. And that's because I was getting really involved in organizations in Chicago, such as the Chicago Bar Association, which had an LGBT committee. And there was another bar association called the Lesbian and Gay Bar Association of Chicago. And so through networking, I was introduced to the chief of staff of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And that is the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. There's 900 attorneys. It's quite competitive to get in. And so being introduced to the chief of staff is almost as good as being introduced to the elected state's attorney. You know, this is the person who makes hiring decisions. I had a lunch with him, and then I got an interview. I was completely out on my resume, and ultimately I got that job. And I'm quite confident that being out helped me to get that job. And I worked there for 3 years, and during that time, they actually recruit on the basis of sexual orientation at a national conference called Lavender Law. So just by being out, my office sent me around the country to meet other LGBT individuals, to accept their resumes, and the office was proud about the percentage of each class of attorney that would come in each year, about the percentage that was LGBT or diverse. What I've come to learn in Chicago in particular, through running a mentoring program, is that, like Nancy mentioned, many employers really value diversity. So if you're applying for a job where it's a large company and they have a non-discrimination policy on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, that's a big flag that the company values diversity. So it would be to your advantage to be out, I would think. If you're in an area like Chicago and you're applying for a job, it's to your advantage to be out, because people, you know, politically have a certain like mind in that city. So know your employer was my third piece of advice, and you can usually find out information if it's a large company or a public institution about their policies with respect to discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And if they have a policy protecting you, they're probably going to also value diversity. And then the third piece of my career is moving to Indiana, which I moved here in 2013 when my partner finished his residency. And so I've lived here since 2013. I immediately joined the Allen County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. And once again, complete shift in political landscape. I moved from a Democratic administration of a prosecutor's office to a Republican administration. Illinois was on the cusp of legalizing same-sex marriage when I left. Indiana was rapidly trying to ban it in the Constitution, despite the fact that it was already illegal. So it's a whole other universe, and I came to this state and I was completely out on my resume. I felt like I accomplished certain things while I was in Chicago that I was proud of and I wanted to include on my resume. And when I interviewed with Karen Richards, the elected prosecutor here in Allen County, I was out. I was talking about the reason I had moved from St. Louis to Chicago to Indiana to follow my partner. And I was so comfortable doing that it made the people I was talking to comfortable. So I feel like it took me, you know, a decade, but I've learned to be true to myself, and I believe that in and of itself is an asset. Being LGBT can be an asset to certain employers, but know your employer, know your rights, and be true to yourself are my main piece of advice. And then the last thing I'll say is with respect to your rights here in Indiana, there are executive orders that provide protection on the basis of both gender identity and sexual orientation to public employees in this state, but there are no protections in the private sector. But then with respect to your rights in Fort Wayne, there is a local ordinance that would provide legal protections on the basis of sexual orientation only. So particularly if you're transgender, there are gaps in your rights all over the place. We're seeing expanded rights on the basis of sexual orientation, but really frequently they leave out gender identity, which is, in my opinion, unfortunate. So that's sort of a little bit about my background, a little bit about the rights that you would see in these three big Midwestern states. Do you want to open it up to questions?
Yeah, and I'll just add something else, because I know a lot of you are potentially going to be like in HR offices, and you're probably wondering, well, what can we do to not discriminate? What does it mean to not discriminate? And it's really just about not treating people differently just because of their sexual orientation. Being careful on forms. Some of the forms you'll see are still antiquated. You've got HR forms. You know, if you're a man, do you have a wife? Okay, so make sure that the language on forms is, you know, it's just do you have a spouse instead of do you have a wife. So less gendered. There's not really a whole lot you need to do to be fair. You just basically treat us like anybody else. Make sure that our spouses are invited to, or our partners. But it does get a little bit trickier with transgender protections because
Here's something I'll add to that.
Yeah.
I've been interviewed before, and I have something on my resume that indicates that I'm gay. And a frequent way that you're interviewed is someone will look at your resume and ask you questions, like they're going down the list, asking you about every little thing on your resume. And interviewers have come to that section, and you can see them reading it, and then they just won't ask you questions.
Yeah.
That's a little trickier for, I think that happened to me in Chicago,
Yeah.
where there are these employment protections. So the employer or the HR people might not exactly know how to ask or what they can or can't ask.
I mean, frankly, if you've never had a gay friend, you're going to feel awkward. You are. You know, there's a learning curve, and it's okay to feel awkward. I had a boss, for example, who was so excited to find out, you know, that I was bisexual and I date women. He wanted to start having really inappropriate conversations, like comparing what kind of girls do you find attractive. I'm like, you know, we're still in a workplace. Just because I'm bisexual doesn't mean you get to have that conversation with me. And he would call me up and say, I have a client who's gay. Do you know him? I'm like, no, we're in the city of Cleveland. There are a lot of gay people. But I wasn't offended by that, you know, because, you know, people are learning. So it's okay to be uncomfortable. And just make an effort to be a human being, really. So, yeah.
One other comment, because this is a diverse audience, I wanted to mention Gerald Ediger, who's here. He's another out gay practicing attorney in Fort Wayne who has lived in this area a lot longer than I have. As I mentioned, I moved here in 2013. And so, you know, he probably has more insight into what it's been like to be out in this community than I would. But there are people like that all over the place. So with respect to networking, if you're out and you can be identified as an out practitioner in whatever field, you can connect to people, and they're generally going to be like an ally in your search for employment. So I've found that to be very, very valuable professionally. Did you want to add anything?
I've just kind of been myself. I think the best thing that you said is be yourself, be true to yourself. There's a certain nonchalance I think gay people can take towards who they are at this point. I do refer to my spouse. My spouse happens to be a man. You know, but I don't have to come into an employment interview waving a pride flag. You know, if there are things on my resume, actually probably the most interesting thing on my resume that I've been asked about is the fact that my junior year abroad in the 70s, I attended the University of Nairobi. So when I show up for an interview, oftentimes people are surprised at my color because they are surprised that this old white guy went to an African university for a year. So that's been kind of an interesting experience, both plus and minus, which I've always kept on my resume. I'm very proud of that year. When I was a college student, when I was probably about your age, being gay was still classified as a psychiatric disorder. So if that gives you any perspective on the distance we've traveled within what seems like my brief lifetime. Moving to Fort Wayne, the first openly gay employee of the city of Fort Wayne was appointed by a Republican mayor, Paul Helmke, who was a three-term mayor of Fort Wayne, protege of Karen Richards, protege of my boss, who is the chairman of the Indiana Workers' Comp Board. And I think that probably your experience with working in the prosecutor's office was again, be yourself. It's a certain degree of nonchalance that you can approach it with. It's like, assume you're normal. Don't walk in assuming that I'm anything but normal. Normal is a setting on a washing machine. It's probably the best. We all have our own unique histories. And, I think look for allies not only within the LGBT community, but look for allies within women's groups, within African American groups. I joined the NAACP when I was 16. There were no gay groups when I was 16. But in working with the struggle for other people, I felt like I was also advancing not only their rights, but my own. And I think that that's historically what has happened, is that as a result of the struggles and sacrifices of African Americans, it has made it possible for women and gays and other groups to have the courage to assert their rights. I think it's probably tragic that gay rights have in many ways advanced faster and further than some of the rights of African Americans. And so that's why I think it's also particularly important to know who your allies are and look for allies, not only within our own community, look for allies within the straight community and also other particular groups. That's kind of my story. I think the history of, my history, over the past 30-some years represents ways to deal with Vietnam, ways to deal with the outbreak of a disease that was killing people that I knew and nobody had a name and nobody knew why. So dealing with other historical events is all a part of dealing with being who we are and identifying who our allies are. So thank you all.
Thanks, Joe.
I think another thing I want to throw in is geography. It really, like David mentioned, the climate you find yourself in can change dramatically with your geography. And I've had to adjust moving from Cleveland to Fort Wayne. In Cleveland, kind of the default was, I had a really big women's community in Cleveland. I had like 100 close lesbian friends. We did everything together. It's like every weekend I had lots of different events to choose from with the women's community, and everybody was out. The default was out. You could just safely assume that if you're at an event with other people who are LGBT, you can post a picture of the party, put it on Facebook, no big deal. Here it is exactly the opposite. I cannot find any kind of real women's community. There's little groups of 3 or 4 people, but you don't have a big community, and the default is closeted in Fort Wayne, at least in the women's community, because people are still scared. And the fear, I think, comes from the fact that there is still some prejudice in this community, and it doesn't often take the form of blatant, oh, I'm going to fire you because you're a lesbian. It doesn't happen that way. It's much more subtle. It's just being treated differently, and you can't prove why, but you know that your employer's uncomfortable with you because they know this about you and they have certain beliefs. And so it's a subtle thing, and it's hard to prove. You can't, just because you know you're being discriminated against for your sexual orientation doesn't mean you can ever prove it in a court of law, even if you do have rights on the books. So now I'm turning a little more negative, but the reality is you should be perceptive also of your LGBT friends and know that maybe they are choosing to be closeted, and for them that's a valid and important choice for their own safety. Everybody comes out in the way that feels right to them and the way that feels safe to them. So I accept that the majority of the people I know in this town are not as out as my friends back in Cleveland were. And I accept that they have reasons, why they feel it's not necessarily safe. And I hope that day, will soon be a day of the past. I think some of it's generational. I think you guys are in a great generation that's more open-minded and fair. I really believe that. And the older people get, the more set in their prejudices they are. So I do think that, we're moving in the right direction, and more people are going to feel safe being out. But not everybody's going to be out and that's okay. Everybody has to come out in their own way, on their own time frame.
All right, we have a question.
You keep talking about know your rights, but where do we find our rights? And if we do find it, and it's written usually with a lot of legal jargon, which, I mean, I'm a pre-law student, so I read a lot of it, I'm adjusting to it, it's easy for me to understand. But people who don't have that background might not be able to read the law, the statutes, and understand it. Where can we go to find our rights that we can,
You know, I apologize. Yeah, I was going to have a handout, and I forgot to do it because I guess my cold got the better of me. But there are some fantastic organizations out there on the internet that have, I think, pretty easy to understand information. And one of them, I think it's the handout that I passed out. I think that was from Lambda Legal. No, that one's from the ACLU. So the ACLU has some really good LGBT rights stuff on it. Lambda Legal is great. They have a lot of charts and graphs and breaking things down into simple English. So,
So for Lambda Legal specifically, they have a map that looks just like the handout that you got. You can go to your state, and it divides rights, just as I mentioned, by public sector or private employment, and also on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So it's really very simple. With a generalized Google search, I would look first to your state, and then second to your local. If you're in Fort Wayne, you know it's a local ordinance that gives you sexual orientation protections for the basis of employment, and then don't forget to overlook your employer wherever you're applying. To see if they have policies in place.
and that's really easy to do, and it's really important to do, because all you have to do is go to your employer's webpage, and the vast majority of employers these days, if they are friendly, they'll have a little diversity tab, and you click on the diversity tab, and there's their diversity statement that says, hey, we like LGBT people, and then you know you're fine.
In fact, it's very rare today, I think, for a big company, like a national company, to not have some sort of diversity policy.
And we have one. Indiana Tech has one that's inclusive of both sexual orientation and gender identity.
Nancy, we're also putting together for the virtual career centers a list of resources for students. So we hope to have those up within a week, and I'll send an email out where you can go if you want access to these sites and stuff.
I think that's important to also mention is that, like I said, when I started my career in 2006, just to today, I didn't have a mentor. There was not even an organization at my law school until we started one. There wasn't an LGBT bar association in St. Louis when I entered the profession there. And today, there are so many resources. There are mentoring programs specifically for LGBT people. So, so the resources are the world has changed in one decade, and going back even further, like Gerald was mentioning, it's a completely different universe, but you have a lot of resources out there, and it's awesome that you're putting together a...
And I should give a plug because I sit on the board of directors for the Northeast Indiana Diversity Library, which is housed in the basement of IPFW's Helmke Library, but it's not associated with IPFW. They're just giving them the space, but it's the largest collection of LGBT written resources in the state. So you've got that right up the road. You had a question?
Yeah, well, partially a comment, partially a question. What kind of protections are afforded to people who work for organizations that have comprehensive non-discrimination policies that include sexual orientation and gender identity, one? And two, why should folks, even folks who aren't LGBTQ, look for that in non-discrimination policies with organizations as they're seeking jobs, or if they're working in HR, why should they fight for that to be in the organizational policies of the places that they work?
I can tell you how it worked in Ohio. I can't speak to the specifics of how it plays out in Indiana, but in Ohio, because I used to do employment discrimination work, I'm licensed in Ohio, but not Indiana. In Ohio, the way that it worked was, if you work for a company that had an employment discrimination policy or any kind of policy that was written down and not being enforced, you actually have a law in Ohio that says this is a violation of public policy is a legal claim. So you can actually file for damages for violating their own policy. You can have like kind of contract type claims. There's different types of creative kind of arguments you can make, but it's not as good as if we had a state statute. It's harder to make those types of claims, but I don't know exactly how it plays out in Indiana either. But
Well, and then your second part of your question is, why is it important to have those policies? I'd say, generally speaking, none of you are going to want to work in a place where you can't be yourself. You might think, oh, this job is more important than being myself when it's your first job coming out of school. But the truth is, as I could testify to, that first year I spent at the Public Defender's Office in St. Louis, it's just not, it's not comfortable to not be yourself. And even if you're not a member of the LGBT community, there might be some other important aspect to your identity that if you had to suppress that, you just wouldn't be comfortable in that work environment. So employers who have these policies, who they will make people who work in, many people from an older generation have these jobs, and they've held these jobs for long periods of time, and they have never come out. I mean, we have both come out, but there are many, many people who just have not come out. So having those policies might encourage them to tiptoe out of the closet like I did about a decade ago.
And another thing that I forgot to mention is most places of employment, especially large places of employment, have an internalized grievance process where if they violate their own policy, you can file a grievance. And some of it is just like shaming them too, like, you let this happen on your watch. And I got to say, Indiana Tech is one of the most friendly environments I've ever worked in as far as this. So I can't imagine ever, having to use the grievance procedure here, but we have one. So there is some comfort knowing that if I were to get discriminated against on my sexual orientation, which again, I've never even come close to happening here, and I don't think ever would, I would be able to file a grievance. And that's not as adversarial as suing. Sometimes it's really good to resolve things in that kind of a manner, to just sit down at the table and say, are you aware that this happened, and can we make sure this doesn't happen again, and take it to a mediator maybe. There's so many other options besides lawsuits out there for resolving problems. And sometimes people are just on a steep learning curve and they mess up, and they really don't have the worst intent in their hearts. They just were clumsy. And so it's good to be open to resolving things that kind of way too, even if you don't have the statute on the books.
And I'd also say one of the ways we have advanced our movement, so to speak, would be through incremental little steps, like people who get anti-discrimination policies established in their companies, one company at a time, until it's, generally speaking, the industry norm to have these policies. Same with different bar associations. Like when I was a member of the Chicago Bar Association, we fought to have a policy position in favor of same-sex marriage adopted by the organization. And little bar association by bar association, municipality by municipality, all of these little rights accumulate to this movement, which now, you can feel how it's advancing, particularly in the past few years. So, Gerald?
Part of the question that I heard is why diversity matters at all. And I co-facilitated diversity training for a unit of General Electric for 3 years. And some of the materials that we presented started off with the story of the potato. And the potato originated in Peru, and they have many varieties of potatoes. Some that do well in sun, some that do well in shade, some that do well in just dozens of varieties. In Ireland, in the 19th century, they grew one kind of potato. And when they had a potato bug, it wiped out the entire crop, and it created mass starvation, mass immigration to the U.S. And so sometimes monocultures are dangerous because you don't get multiple perspectives. And so if you are here and you're just here because you're an ally or interested or somebody told you should go, that's one thing to consider, is that opening up to diverse opinions is important and is gives you a better result than if you simply hear the same thing from the same people over and over again. In getting diverse perspectives, whatever they are, within an organization is helpful to that organization. I think that's the fundamental fact, the fundamental philosophy underlying why diversity matters at all.
Well, there's actual, I know a lot of you think in terms of money and business and finance because that's part of what Indiana Tech's about. And so we're pragmatic thinkers, like we think in terms of the pocketbook. It's expensive to discriminate. I mean, a study just came out that it cost the state of Indiana $60 million last year, all the boycotts against the state because they thought that we were discriminatory. And it costs money to hire new people, to train new people. Having really bad employee retention is kind of expensive. So it just makes business sense to make sure that your employees are comfortable, that your customers are comfortable. And by comfortable, I don't mean, if you hate gay people, you shouldn't be forced to work with them. I just mean that discrimination is prohibited. And that you send that message loud and clear both to your employees and to people doing business with you, that everybody's welcome at your business. And it makes sense financially to do that.
I'm an English professor here, and I wanted to mention that we do have a Gay Straight Alliance organization. So if anyone is interested in being part of that, you can see me, or I know we have several GSA members in attendance today. If you don't mind raising your hand so people can see who you are, right? And it's for LGBT people, but also allies. And it's a really important organization, and if you're interested, I would encourage you to join.